Ja, nach so viel Vorschusslorbeeren kann ich es nur noch verderben. Nein, meine Damen und
What compliments on my research activities. I'm delighted now to be speaking you this morning. And it is a bit nostalgic as well for me to hear about that, your experience, and I'm delighted to meet everybody here today. Never before in the history of people have so many different generations living together, or have had to live together, have had the pleasure of living together, perhaps. And this makes things quite interesting for me, but I also believe it makes it quite complex and complicated too. So what are the needs, necessities and opportunities? Well, there are various ideas and potential solutions for this. And as you have heard, I'd be happy to provide some fundamentals on this. Now, it's important to bear in mind that there are also some dark spots in our knowledge in terms of human behaviour, and whenever there is a gap in our knowledge, there is a certain danger there, which is why I welcome the concept of this particular ETH Housing Forum. To ask, well, how should we go about this? Well, here, the demographic development over time. You can see this is a new constellation now between generations. The orange line, the quota of elderly and people of a certain age. This is on the rise, as you can see. It's interesting from a statistical point of view. And then we have the quota there for young people. And you have the different scenarios that are played through by the Federal Statistical Office. And you can then try to predict what things will look like in the future. But of course, all of this is very speculative in nature. And you can see how this gap opens up towards the right, and that provides us with an outlook that is somewhat disquieting, I would say. I have been asked to say a few words about the definition of generation and generations. Perhaps this is an important point. There's a great deal of mixing that happens here from a definition standpoint, but essentially we can distinguish between three different ways to set this out. So you could be asking about people's age then. So young people, adults, elderly, those of very advanced age, and then perhaps more familial generations that we've heard of before. So you have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, grandchildren, evidently. And then perhaps what pops up in medial discourse are generations as a societal and historic or social group. These are groups that have something in common in terms of what they have experienced, what their interests might be. And these are the generations that are most commonly referenced nowadays. You have the baby boomers, of course, Generation X, Y, Z. Now, when you consult this information, you realize that there are several associations that are triggered by seeing these generation labels. And of course, there are intergenerational differences between these generations, we can see here. But I'm also very cautious in approaching this because I find it irritating when these generations are spoken about as if they were entirely uniform, because despite there being intergenerational differences, there are also intra-generational differences, so within generations. Now, of course, these may be even more pronounced than those between generations. And so let's just be a little bit informed about how we perceive these labels, shall we? Then we also have the relationships between generations, and that's the big question here. Now, if we think back to before the times of fully fledged social insurance and we think about what the intergenerational contract means, then we know that as a principle, young people are expected to help the elderly in a certain way. And if we look to discourse nowadays, then we'll often hear about the generations being at loggerheads, about the intergenerational contract being under threat, asking whether familial solidarity is actually coming to an end or not. And of course, if you have a society that has to harbour several generations in one go, then there are issues that have to be addressed, and this has to be done in a differentiated manner. Now, to allow us to do this, let's have a look at a few facts. So, intergenerational relationships. I don't think this is quite as bad as seems to be made out quite a lot of the time. People do want to look after one another in principle. There is a certain amount of solidarity around. People do tend to stick together, even if you have a look at financial transfers. But even the childcare that is provided by grandparents, for instance, is relevant, or younger members of the family looking after older members of the family in terms of care. And this is often set aside when we are asking about how the generations relate to one another. So here, I advocate for a very clear way of addressing this and to appreciate that there is solidarity here, but there are limits to that. Families are becoming smaller. There are ever more people who choose not to have any children, don't have children. Then the nucleus of the family, the core family element there, those few people then have to be able to deal with the same as was previously dealt with by more people. So this is an important thing to bear in mind. So, family intergenerational relationships. Now, what about this from a societal standpoint? Here too, there is talk of there being this gap between generations. The generation barometer that was commissioned, this consulted people throughout Switzerland, and it was made very clear that people in Switzerland, some don't see a gap at all, but only 26 people do actually see that gap. So what is the issue here? I think perhaps it's about a loss of empathy in society. Where are the gaps actually? Perhaps they are more between the poor and the rich. Perhaps this is not necessarily a huge raging gap, but what we do have is a way of life in society where people seem to live out their lives in parallel with one another rather than together. There seems to be a lack of touch points. There is a lack of a culture of dialogue. And problems that we encounter over time then presents an additional hurdle, namely negative associations of age, the way we perceive older people, that image that we have, especially among younger people, believing that perhaps older people are somewhat parasitic in nature. What I would like to say, though, is even if before there were fewer generations living side by side, these ambivalencies were always a topic. There were always certain tensions. It's just that, these have to be dealt with. They had to be dealt with before. They still have to be dealt with today. So a few facts for you then. Now, let's arrive at the requirements, the necessities. How can we live together? Because this is part of health, if you see this as per the World Health Organization's definition of health. And I once again refer to the pandemic, where physical health became the primary focus, whereas perhaps social well-being is also an aspect that we should be bearing in mind. The COVID pandemic is something that we can't really circumvent when we're addressing these issues, because it was a turning point for individuals, but also for society at large. On an individual level, we reached our limits. We realized that we can't always make our own decisions about everything. We can't control everything. there are societal relationships between different things, and this whole experience, feeling like we are not able to be self-determined within this context is tricky. From a societal standpoint, we also realize that we seem to have somewhat problematic tendencies when it comes to, let's say, intergenerational relationships in society. This was very ambivalent. There is a great deal of solidarity, and we were able to witness this. And on the other side of the story, there was a great deal of negativity in the headlines. A lot of ambivalence, I would say. And so now, on the one hand, we see that yes, it does work. People help one another. Those of very advanced age can expect to have some help with, say, grocery shopping, etc. But there are certainly downsides to this. More negative aspects, perhaps. I think the COVID pandemic was a stress test for intergenerational relationships. The medial discourse I mentioned earlier often seeks to focus on essentially playing generations off one another. The young versus the old, and the old are against the young. But actually, look, who is old? When does old start? And where does young end? It's not all that easy. And people try to blame specific groups in society. But what touched me in a way was a survey conducted by Prof. And according to this survey, people were asked, it was a very representative study, I have to say, they were asked, what do you think? What did the COVID pandemic do to intergenerational relationships? And 32% of those surveyed expected that the consequences would be negative. Now, 32% expecting a negative outcome, fine. But actually, what struck me more was that 52% of people didn't have an opinion. So here again, knowing, not knowing, knowing things in part, this is dangerous territory. We see that we need some kind of societal exchange. We need these relationships. We need intergenerational setups to work. So what do we have to do about this? What is urgent right now? There are limits to individualism. The singularization mentioned by Jennifer too, as regards people living alone and doing so increasingly. But also when we look at individualization, we see that there are limits to that. And self-determination is wonderful. It's wonderful to have freedom in that way. And nonetheless, there are limits to how beneficial freedom can be, because you arrive at a certain point when it's the flip side of the coin, and you then see that if you insist on your personal freedoms and you insist on staying in your own home, on your own, being autonomous, irrespective of the square footage that you have, you arrive at the boundaries of what social cohesion can stand. But that's also a personal thing, in that can be negative too, because people themselves become more lonely as a consequence. And this is something that this is a thought that we can follow. It makes sense. It's logical. The numbers here speak very clearly. We see here that loneliness experienced a little dip there, and it is now on the rise once again. This was also deduced from survey results. And you see that people experience loneliness. But you know, when we consult graphs like this, we have to be a little careful about our interpretation, because actually, if you take 65 plus as a category, then you have essentially two groups, two age groups, because 65 plus in general is certainly less lonely, say, than 80 plus. So here, once again, please exercise caution and a little extra common sense in analysing these results here. When we ask about social support then, and asking, do you feel you are being supported enough? We see that the older people become, especially, say, 75 onwards, there, people are really sad that social support is not where it should be. So you can read these statistics and come to various conclusions. But for me, I'm sorry, 65 plus as a category, that's just not good enough. So loneliness, as we've addressed, this is a relevant topic, ladies and gentlemen. It's a huge topic because loneliness, again and again, it's picked up on, and I'm glad that it is picked up on repeatedly, because loneliness makes people ill. We don't need to conduct further studies on this to believe it. Even if loneliness is a topic that is gaining recognition, it still seems to be a bit of a taboo. Especially those who are impacted by it seem to have difficulty speaking up about it. This is an age of influencers and the like, with everybody presenting this image that everyone has thousands of friends and everybody's this fabulous. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a problem pertaining to individuals, this is a problem throughout society. Because there is a great deal of suffering involved, yes, but there are also a great many costs that are related to this, because if the illnesses associated with loneliness have to be paid for, who pays for that? We pay for them. So perhaps there should be somebody dealing more closely with loneliness in this regard. If we were to put the money into tackling this problem, I believe this would be a worthwhile investment. Now, just before the pandemic, a very nice report was published on the future of aging. And it said, suicide, social isolation and loneliness are epidemics on the rise. And wasn't that true? And this was just before the COVID pandemic, and then obviously that only served to emphasize this. We've already addressed the increase in one-person households, but then there is also an increase in mobility in terms of where people live and work. Often we also don't just work in one place either. There seems to be a little bit less of a binding nature of social encounters too. People are less likely to stick to the arrangements that they have made. And as we see with the solidarity topic, there is just less manpower, if you like, in families on account of there being fewer people. And so this poses a threat to the intergenerational contract. We have another set of statistics here from the Federal Statistical Office, and these are the households. You see the blue line there, for example. You can see that in 1920 it starts, and you have the forecast then that follows on into the future on the right-hand side. So this is not just about living space, but also about loneliness. But let's just be clear, not everybody who lives alone is lonely. That's not what I'm saying. But of course, there is an inherent danger that that may be the case. So, for our new approach to living together, we have to seize opportunities. And that's why I'm so delighted that various approaches will be discussed here today. I believe we require a mindset shift. We have to keep this in the back of our minds that we cannot circumvent this question as to generations being there for one another, Solidarity across generations is not something to be taken for granted. It doesn't just work all on its own. We have to arrive at a situation in which it is facilitated, and this requires better knowledge of one another. This doesn't necessarily mean knowledge from books, from presentations, knowledge from the media. No, we have to create opportunities for people to encounter one another, to exchange the way they experience life, so that various opinions can butt up against one another, so that they can then lead to more harmonious solutions to things. It's important not to be too hasty, to reduce people to how they are categorized into generations, because as soon as we start to see social demographic issues and we start to assign those very specifically to a certain subset of a demographic, then that doesn't put us in a position to really advance matters. This is something that is perhaps not addressed as often as it should be. But actually, generational questions are also gender questions. Let's not forget, women are largely the king-keepers in terms of generations and families, but also throughout society. Care work is a topic that is addressed in discourse, but it should be done so more readily. Now here in particular, it is the task of the older generation, and I count myself among this group, to do something about this. There is a generativity at play here that is required. Don't leave this to the younger people. Sometimes younger people have better resources if they're better networked, but older people have to take responsibility for the situation. What I notice time and again is that it's important not to forget, when we speak about intergenerational relationships, we are talking about people. These are not just baby boomers. This is not just generations. These are people, and people are different. That's very important to remember. We have to reinforce cohesion and avoid loneliness, evidently. That's obvious. Raise awareness, reduce these stigmatized topics, these taboos, and move away from stereotypes. I've had enough of Generation Z and Y and whatever else, how they're going to be labelled in the future. What are we going to do? Start at the beginning of the alphabet again, A, B, C, or what? Look, I believe we have to provide opportunities for people to encounter one another and produce new definitions of this. So the complex tasks that arise over time, it will be more and more difficult to address these and solve issues with fewer people around per family line. So is this a societal issue? Should care work, for instance, be considered outside of the family unit? If you have grandparents, grandmothers, grandfathers, looking after other members of the family, but then they are not cared for by others, well, that doesn't reflect very well in our society, does it? Innovative living, constellations, having people be able to come together, and I don't just mean at the community centre every now and then, I mean having these opportunities for encounters just emerge in people's lives. It is not possible to focus on the old and the young in turn because we live together. So if we invest in one, then it always has repercussions for the other group. So this participative approach is very important to me, especially because the approaches that we advocate for here, that we develop today, we have to discuss those with the people who are actually impacted. We have to apply this to real life. And it's important for it to be seen as an enrichment rather than a threat. I do believe I started a little bit later than expected, so forgive me if I'm not quite finished just yet. I'm almost done. So these generational projects then, thankfully, there are projects of this kind. There are more and more of these projects. There are housing constellations where intergenerational living is facilitated. Thankfully, this is becoming more commonplace. So we have real-life examples to work from. Now, for decades now, people have said again and again, and I'm looking at my colleagues now, François, this only works if we leverage the diversity that exists across generations, if we appreciate the differentiation, but also identities. The baby boomers are allowed to be baby boomers. It's okay for them to have an identity of their own. It's okay for them to be proud of things that they have achieved, that have become established, and let's not paternalize people. But also, let's not pursue overly ingratiating ways either. Whether this is a language question, if everything's cool all of a sudden, generational differences do require respect. People need to be able to encounter one another on a level playing field. So this is a concept with a great deal of potential. And this opens up the framework for upcoming presentations that we'll obviously go into a little further depth today. But I believe that a mixture of generations in living constellations, in housing, say in a neighborhood, in a complex of apartments, perhaps. We have to understand how we can leverage the potential that is inherent to people. This is not necessarily to say, okay, so an older person perhaps is retired, and what do retirees do during their retirement? You know, if they have 30 years or so to pursue what they want to do. And to have the people in their rush hour of life be somewhat alleviated of their pressures, and to make sure we're looking after children, young people, fostering them. And also, ladies and gentlemen, all of these age groups can benefit from one another because they are complementary to one another, because each generation, each age group has certain strengths. And this is necessary too. It's not a question of whether this is something that we want. This is something that we have to pursue, and it is a great benefit. Ladies and gentlemen, we all have our strengths and our weaknesses, and each of us brings something to the table that can be useful to somebody else. So I hope this cuts through the topic and gives you a good overview so that we can now dive into more specific topics over the course of the day. Thank you for your attention this morning, and have a good discussion.
Großes Dankeschön für diesen Blumen.
Thank you very much for this insight and for speaking about how intergenerational living can benefit everyone. Now, were you just friendly when you mentioned the living forms that are important, or is living really important in your opinion? Living is the most intimate thing that we can do. Let's imagine a family. We exchange ideas, we talk, we live and maybe even work among our family members. We exist within our family. And living is part of that. It's intimacy, it's social exchange, it's a place where we recharge our batteries. And if we are on our own, doing all of this on our own, living alone, then everyone would be living in a box in the end, more or less. And what would happen? Everyone would be lonely and depressed, which is absolutely terrible to think about. So living is a very important aspect, probably more important than working, although of course living and working are now really not that separated anymore. As I said, living is intimacy and exchange, so it is important, yes. When I was preparing my questions for today, I looked at intergenerational living and I saw that it's a niche product, basically. And so you are propagating a niche product as the solution for all of the living and housing problems. Of course, all of this doesn't come to be on its own. We have to work for it. If we want to get along, then intergenerational living is a wonderful solution. We could start in politics or in neighborhood assistance or things like that, but living is the easiest way to make it real. I would say let's talk about it more, let's inform the people, and let's not forget that there's the baby boomer generation that is older now and is more open to different forms of living and housing than before. Shared flats at the beginning of the 70s, when I was studying, everyone wanted to live with flatmates. Everyone wanted to get out of the authoritarian cage that was the family, if you will, and live with flatmates in a shared apartment. And this openness in the older generation should be taken into consideration and leveraged. Yes, so you're saying that loneliness would be the end destination, if you will, if we didn't change anything, and that would, of course, be a huge drama. I see that there are some microphones around. If you have any questions or if you want to confront her with something, please feel free to do so. Yes, sorry. Yes, back there. Please. Does this work? Yes. I'm from a city where there are two different cultures. The French-speaking people and the German-speaking people, and a number of people who speak a completely different language. When we look at this topic, it's not just about generations, it's also about cultures. And where are we when it comes to integration, integrating these different cultures and creating a mix of cultures? That is a wonderful example that you have brought up. Belonging to a certain generation is just one of the factors, so that that's just one characteristic, what culture people belong to, what religion they live, family cultures, and so on. When we look at care work, intergenerational care work, where daughters, sons take care of their family members, and there we see, within Switzerland, we see different cultures. Some parents or families choose nursing homes for the elders quite soon. In the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, for example, they keep older family members at home as long as possible. In French-speaking part of Switzerland, the elderly stay at home but have a lot of outside support. So thank you for your input. There are so many facets that we have to take into account when we want to bring together the different generations. It's not the same as if I would be living in the neighborhood that I lived in for 40 years in Basel, which is called Gundeli, and has so many different cultures living together. And it would be different to build something up there than in the neighborhood called Bruderholz, which has a more homogeneous culture when it comes to the residents. I think you had a question? Someone over here? I don't want to force you to ask questions, but just take this opportunity to ask questions. You, Ms. Danat, you were so excited to meet Ms. Perrig, so please feel free to ask something. Is this microphone even on? The red light has to be on. I was very egocentrically thinking about what that would mean for me and my family history and constellation. And I thought about research from the field of psychology that asks what it does to people when adult daughters, this is a friend of mine that I'm speaking about, never get out of this dependency when it comes to the parents. So a daughter caring for her parents, she's vice president at ETH, but she's still the daughter at home and has this responsibility at home. So she's never completely independent. She always has this dependency within the context of the family. So what does that do to the autonomy of a person when within the family they never become completely autonomous? That's something we could talk about for a long time. So these feelings of obligation, we call this the family crisis. Many women, men as well, but mainly women, suffer because people expect them to show solidarity within the family. And I just want to make sure that this expectation of solidarity is not cemented in society. The generation that you are a part of is a lot more educated than the previous generations of women. Women used to just take care of family members before, and they would just be born into these dependencies. But nowadays it's changing. Women are also better educated, and people are saying, do what you want to do. But then the question, of course, arises, who will take care of the elderly? But there are large companies such as Roche and Novartis, and they offer childcare but also elderly care. So they try to appeal to women who can work at the company instead of having taken care of their parents, because the company takes care of them. And the bad feeling that women have, this guilt that women have, is also just caused by society and is something that we have to work on. We also now have new technologies, new solutions for care work. And of course, it's not the same as having a family member take care of the elderly, but we do have new, better or different options now when it comes to taking care of the elderly. And yes, so gender, of course, is also a part of the discussion. So should we maybe be speaking about chosen families? Then we wouldn't be caught up in the whole family unity. It will have to change. Chosen families are something that is definitely on the rise. So family rights activists and so on are saying that family members don't necessarily need to be related by blood, but they can also be friends. We also have partnerships, relationships that are not marriages, for example. So we have to rethink these relationships. Pasqualina, you said something very likable. You said that the elderly should take initiative and start this exchange with other generations. Was this maybe the Swiss way of saying the elderly expect more from other generations and from the intergenerational exchange, and the young people don't really know what to expect? Uli, yes, you are completely right. But I think young people have very different problems than intergenerational relationships. They have the problem of finding their place in society, finding a job that they want to do, working on their relationships, taking care of children, and now they have to take on the question of generations and intergenerational exchange. I just want someone to take charge, and I think that it's the older generation. I have worked in intergenerational projects, and it has been said that only the elderly want those projects to work. And of course, it's because they have more life experience. And of course, yes, because it benefits them. I can't deny that. But yes,
auf Augenhöhe argumentieren. Aber ja, nein, ich bin überzeugt, ich selber habe 2 Söhne.
I myself have 2 sons who are married, and they have very different problems. They don't have time to think about intergenerational relationships, so I think it's up to the older generation. One more question before we take a break. We started a project a few years ago. My son was 10 years ago. My mother had a stroke and was sitting in a wheelchair. And so we had to think about what we should do to take care of everyone. And we thought of this these chosen relations, but bureaucracy was the issue in the end. And I'm here today to see how this intergenerational living and so on is implemented. In Vienna, we have housing for people over 65, housing for people with dogs or whatever, but intergenerational living has never been implemented. So maybe it goes to the extent of having a old people's home next to a kindergarten, but that can't be that's the highest level of intergenerational living. So I very much hope to see some ideas here and to see how bureaucracy can be brought to actually accept these intergenerational living projects and how they were implemented. I hope that a lot of these topics can be discussed more in depth. Yes, and if not, we will speak very sternly with the organizers. Yes, there are a lot of people here today who have a lot of experience in this, who have actually managed to implement these projects. So stay and talk to everyone, exchange business cards and ideas. A big round of applause, and thank you very much, Pasqualina Perrig.